Hi, assholes. Guess who's back? We'll see if I make more than one of these, because let's face it, nobody fucking cares what I have to say. When you've got guys like Little Milo Wolf and Mike and who just go, Lyle sucks with no evidence, you're not going to listen to me. You don't care about facts, evidence, information. But I'm going to try anyway, because I'm bored and forget New Year, new me. New Year, I'm going to keep poking holes in everything these people in the industry say. Because it's funny when you look at the papers that people in this industry jump all over to make their edgelord memes, like Little Milo Wolf, shown here, versus the papers that they don't. And it seems like they always pick the ones that fit their bias, which they then misrepresent while never really discussing what the paper says, like the 52 volume set study, but I digress. Because I'm willing to bet you that the paper I'm going to look at today, nobody is going to talk about. And you'll see why in just a second. So the title of the paper is The Dose-Response Relationship Between Resistance Training Volume and Hypertrophy. There Are Still Doubts, by Buckner SL et al. In the Journal of Trainology 2023, December 29 through 36. And I'll put a link to the ResearchGate full free article in the video notes. So if you want to go pull it and see if the paper says what I say it says, you can. Now I'm just going to use screenshots because that's what I always do, unlike the others in this industry who just expect you to trust them. But I believe in full transparency. Go pull the full paper. See if I misrepresented it in any way, because I promise you I didn't. And as the name suggests, it's looking at the issue of training volume and muscle hypertrophy. Specifically, it's examining the claims made in the paper by Brad Ogborn and James Krieger, titled The Dose-Response Relationship Between Resistance Training Volume and Muscle Hypertrophy. Are there really still any doubts? Is totally the kind of thing that someone who is not biased to high volumes would write, speaking in absolute terms. Are there still any doubts? Yeah, Brad's not biased. Sure. So there's a bunch of introduction talking about that paper and the claims that it made and kind of bringing up the issue that it's probably not quite as clear-cut as that title would make it sound, that there may still be doubts, and it's explaining that they're going to try to examine some of those in terms of literature. But one of the points they make that I think is worth describing is this. In addition, limitations of studies that do not observe a dose response between muscle growth and volume are often pointed out. Sample size too small, untrained, study duration too short, while studies showing a clear dose response are not given the same scrutiny despite similar shortcomings and limitations. A couple comments. We know that's absolutely true. In the bicep study that Brad didn't like, he dismissed it out of hand because they didn't control the rest of the training and the subjects might have done additional arm work. That's true. In his fasted cardio study, the same limitation was present. So we might ask why the fitness industry takes the bicep paper and throws it out, but takes the fasted cardio paper as the final word on the topic. And I would note that Brad in that paper did mention that they might have done additional exercise outside. That doesn't change the fact. One study, two studies with the exact same limitation, the fitness industry ignores one and accepts the one without criticism because Brad's name is on it. You know I'm right. Moving on. Now make no mistake, we all do this to one degree or another. We all look at studies we agree with less scrutiny than those that we disagree with. I'm guilty of it. Y'all are all guilty of it. The difference is Brad pretends he's not guilty of it. All the people who tell you that all they care about the truth ignore their own biases. Nobody's unbiased, including me. The study is unblinded. It doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. That has to be brought up. The study has insufficient people. It doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not. It must be brought up. Somehow, when Brad and James and Menno and Little Milo Wolf and all these people look at high volume studies, they don't apply the same criteria as the studies they don't like. We all need to do better, including me. But I'm the only one who admit it. Moving on. Make a few arguments. The first one is to examine some of the data, and I'm going to skimp a little bit because my voice is sore and I don't want to just be reading to you all this entire time. They essentially look at the data from the Hiesler-Graves study, the Ostrowski study, and one of the Amralithingam, the German volume training studies, all of which I looked at on my website a bunch of years ago. These are the studies that either found that there was no dose response in terms of hypertrophy relative to volume, or in the case of Ostrowski, which it wasn't statistically significant. It looked like moderate was better than low, but high and moderate were the same. That was also the data that Brad misrepresented, by the way. So, like I said, the link is in the notes. Just go look at the paper itself. So they state, well, there is at least a body of literature showing no dose-response relationship. But they also point out, but there are studies that do. And now they talk about Brad's volume paper, the one from 2018. Here I am going to read you exactly what they say. See if it sounds familiar. So they describe the study and then conclude. Overall, the authors suggest a dose-response relationship between volume and skeletal muscle growth in their conclusions. However, when examining the results, there were no significant difference between groups for changes in tricep muscle thickness. In addition, there were no statistical differences between the moderate volume and high volume groups for elbow flexor muscle thickness. BF10 equals 0.6. When examining changes in mid-thigh and lateral thigh, there was weak evidence in favor of high volume versus moderate volume groups. BF10 2.34 and 2.25 for mid-thigh and lateral thigh respectively. Let me note that a BF10 less than 3 in Bayesian statistics is considered irrelevant or insignificant. It's not even weak. Anyway, moving on. They continue, nevertheless, what is most interesting about the finding is there's a large magnitude of skeletal muscle growth observed, specifically 0.72 centimeters of skeletal muscle growth in the high volume group for the lateral thigh over an 8-week time frame is much greater than what is typically observed in the resistance training literature. This is not limited to muscle thickness of the leg, as mid-thigh muscle thickness in the high volume group also observed unusually robust skeletal muscle growth, 0.68 centimeters. Now, this is really one of their major points and one that they will come back to near the end. To put this in perspective, they next look at the study by Aub et al. That also compared 12, 18, or 24 weekly sets to or near muscular failure. About that paper, they state this. Of note, authors observed an increase of 0.15 centimeters at 50% the distance of the anterior thigh in the 24 weekly set group. In the Schoenfeld investigation, the mid-thigh measurement increased by 0.68 centimeters in the 45 weekly set condition. Such large differences between studies stand out, particularly when it's considered that Schoenfeld et al. Observed a magnitude of growth that was 4 times that observed by Aub et al. The impressiveness of such a large change in muscle thickness will be discussed in subsequent sections. They continue by looking at another study, Brad, that had to do with rest periods, the 1 minute versus 3 minute thing. I'm not going to go into detail in it other than to state this because they make the same point, which is, they state, it is interesting to note that for the anterior thigh, the long group, plus 0.71 centimeters, experienced nearly double the increase in muscle thickness than that of the short group, 0.36 centimeters. This is a similar magnitude of growth as observed in the 45 weekly set group of the volume investigation previously discussed. It is outside of what is typically seen in the literature. Similar, the changes in triceps brachii was several times greater in the long group, plus 0.29 centimeters, when compared to the short group, plus 0.02. Authors speculated that such differences in muscle growth were driven by the higher total volume load performed by the long group over the 8-week period. However, it is worth noting that there was no statistically significant differences in volume of work performed, nor were there significant correlations between total load volume and changes in the various measurements. The authors suggest that the beneficial effect of longer rest intervals may be mediated by a higher volume load, but ultimately concede that the study was underpowered to make this determination. Which is basically a long way of saying that A, the long versus short rest interval study found growth that is multiple times greater than other studies in the field, and B, despite Brad trying to make it about volume, there was no difference in volume load, and then probably eventually conceding, well, it was statistically underpowered. That didn't stop them from making recommendations about long versus short rest intervals. But let's go back to the point about how much growth is being seen by asking the exact same question the researchers asked. That question being, is this amount of growth possible? If performing higher amounts of training volume were indeed to play this dramatic of a role in promoting muscle growth, it begs the question as to why other studies conducted outside of this research group have not observed such differences in muscle size between groups. It is always an interesting question. If you have dozens or hundreds of other studies finding one result, and then somehow 2 studies from the same lab by an individual who admitted in an interview somewhere that he chose his graduate advisor because he shared his high volume bias, that are getting results that are 4 times that, you have to kind of wonder if maybe that one lab is getting inaccurate results. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So they comment, the investigation by Aub et al. Found no statistically significant differences for muscle growth in resistance-trained men For 8 weeks of lower body exercise and performing either 12, 18, or 24 weekly sets to or near volitional fatigue. Pertaining changes in anterior thigh muscle thickness, authors observed the highest response in the 12 weekly set group, plus 0.38 centimeters, whereas the 24 weekly set group observed the lowest responses, plus 0.15, despite performing double the amount of exercise sets. When one looks for both an absolute and relative perspective, the changes in the highest response group in this study, plus 0.38, were on par with the lowest response group, plus 0.36, observed in the previously mentioned study for anterior thigh muscle thickness in nearly half of the highest response group, plus 0.71 centimeters, which is quite surprising. Note, by previous study, they mean Brad's paper. And providing another example, referring back to the Amirthalingam et al. Investigation, authors found no statistical significance in anterior thigh MT following 6 weeks of either 5 or 10 sets per lower body exercise per visit in resistance trained men, despite the 10-set per session group performing double the training volume. The magnitude of muscle growth observed was higher in the lower volume group, plus 0.26 centimeters. Again, these changes in muscle thickness are significantly less in magnitude, both absolute and relative, compared to the previously mentioned studies in similar muscle groups, populations with similar study durations. So again, for some reason, a study found that not only were lower volumes as good, if not better, than higher volumes, the growth is once again significantly less than in Brad's studies. Finishing up. Spare you the screenshots because I'm getting tired. They mentioned we're trying to interpret key papers. It's important to look at other papers finding results similar to Brad's. They mentioned two. The first was the study by Barbalo, which has been retracted, so they talk about it no more. The other one was the H&B study by Jacob Wilson, that basically everyone accepts was bullshit. It found results greater than steroids, and honestly, they don't count. Which is to say, Brad's in really good company here with his results. To sum up that section, the paper then gathered a whole bunch of studies. They state, again, those screenshots, in an attempt to provide further perspective, lower body muscle growth measured across several resistance training studies provided in Table 3. And I'll put those all at the very end of the video. Here's what they state in the aggregate. The reader can look across several different studies from different labs and note the slight differences in muscle growth across various time frames, from 4 weeks to 24 weeks. However, muscle growth rarely appears to exceed 0.4 centimeters over an 8 to 12 week duration. In addition, the reader may observe that the average change across all studies is around 0.28 centimeters. The studies included in this table were not necessarily designed to examine the influence of training volume on muscle growth adaptations. Instead, these studies are included to better familiarize the reader with common muscle thickness changes that are observed following resistance training interventions. This will allow the reader to further evaluate the available data and ponder possibilities, much like ourselves. While no data should be dismissed or discredited, it may result in putting less weight in certain studies until replication of the results is performed. Again, is a very long way of saying that the grand majority of studies, in fact, all but the ones from Brad's labs and the Barbalo retracted study and the bullshit Jacob Wilson study, have found levels of muscle growth something like 3 to 4 times lower than Brad's studies. This doesn't mean Brad's studies are automatically or should be automatically dismissed. It just falls under things that make you go, why is his one lab finding results that no other lab has ever produced? Unless they were lying, like Barbalo or Jacob Wilson. That's the final section that they examine, and see if any of this sounds familiar. So in trying to explain the discrepancy, these authors offer 3 possibilities, and I'm only going to screenshot the second and third because, again, I'm tired. The first one is just, it is possible that such dissimilarities in muscle growth may very well be explained by methodological differences between groups. It is important to consider that often non-exercise control groups are missing from interventions. This may be crucial to understanding the error of measurements when imaging muscle sites several weeks apart, and may better aid in contextualizing the magnitude of muscle growth observed. I would note that, blinding, when Brad is doing the ultrasound, as he was in those studies, given that he said he picked a graduate advisor who shared his bias, it's something to consider. Now, admittedly, most of these other studies weren't blinded either. The point is that ultrasound is subject to interpretation, and how you do it and what you're looking for may very well change what you find. But all labs, whether I agree with the studies or not, all fucking labs must blind the ultrasound assessor. Now, I realize Brad has written a paper recently about the need to blind, but he didn't blind his first 17 studies. This is him getting ready to retire and wanted to look better than he ever was as a researcher by telling others to live up to a standard that he won't live up to himself. The second possible explanation is really the one I want to focus on, so I am going to screenshot this again. Another possibility is that the excess swelling resulting from high-volume protocols may be misinterpreted for muscle growth. Although swelling does not appear to accumulate across a training week and is suggested to dissipate 48 to 72 hours following a training bout, it does seem possible that heightened swelling may be present with high-volume training. For example, the study cited by Schoenfeld et al. For their suggestion that acute increases in muscle thickness return to baseline within 48 hours after a resistance training session is a paper that cites pilot data not presented, to suggest that acute muscle swelling from bench press exercise returns to baseline within 24 hours. Furthermore, the protocol used in the paper referenced had participants perform 3 sets of 10 repetitions on the bench press exercise 3 days per week, 9 sets per week total, which is considerably less than what was employed in the Schoenfeld investigation. In addition, Buckner et al. Demonstrated that swelling may be minimal in the days following an exercise bout. However, authors had individuals perform an acute exercise bout consisting of 4 sets of biceps curls at 70% of participants, 1 RM. When training with higher volumes, perhaps additional days, e.g. 96 to 120 hours between the final training session and post-testing, are necessary to allow swelling and inflammation to decrease. Catch it? Because it's the exact same point I've been making for years. Every single paper cites the same reference stating that swelling goes down within 48 to 72 hours. They all use the same language. However, that study used 9 sets per week, 3 sets for the final workout. You cannot assume in either direction that the time course of swelling for higher volumes, 15 sets in Brad's study, fucking 26 for the recent bullshit study, are automatically the same as 3 sets. You can't. Especially when you consider that study by Cody Hahn that Mike Israetel was on found that above 20 sets per week, there was increased water retention. Now, let me be clear, because I'm the only one who seems to actually talk in scientific language. I'm not saying that the swelling does or doesn't decrease in that time frame. I'm not, because we don't know. The point is we don't know. But without that data, you cannot make that fucking assumption. You can't. Well, no good scientist would make that assumption. You cannot extrapolate from insufficient data. And this one study is insufficient data. Drawing conclusions from a set using 3 sets versus even 4 sets, Buckner is one of the authors and cites their own paper, because they're intellectual. You cannot extrapolate that to 15 sets. Because if, in the case of Brad's study, the final workout for legs would have been 3 sets, 9 sets, or 15 sets, right? 9, 27, 45 per week. It's entirely possible, and I would say probable, that in the 15 set group, any supposed increased growth was water. But again, we need that data. Someone needs to do the fundamental work on this by testing a bunch of different volumes, ideally in maybe biceps and quads, since those are most commonly measured, and then seeing what the actual time frame of fluid shifts are. This should not be hard. Get a bunch of people, do 3 sets, 6 sets, measure for a week, 9, 12, 12, 15, measure for a week, see what happens. We need this data. We have to have this data to draw anything approaching intelligent conclusions. And if you're going to play the PhD card and go, well, Lyle doesn't have a PhD, and you can't see this and I can, then you need to return the Cracker Jack box you got your degree out of. Because this is basic stuff, guys. This is basic stuff. And anyone with an academic, supposed academic degree on this should be able to see it. And yet here we are. Because given that Brad's studies only are finding up to 4.5 times the growth of the majority of studies in the field, is the better explanation that he's found the keys to the kingdom, or that it's fluid swelling, or that his methodology is wrong? Because I'm sorry, if 90 to 95% of studies say one thing, and 2 studies by the same group are discordant, it's far more likely that those 2 studies are the ones that are methodologically flawed. Again, I'm not saying they are or they aren't. I'm not saying that fluid does or does not dissipate in a certain time frame, because people are going to misquote me. We need that fucking data. Until we have it, they're guessing. Before we do another dumb fuck volume study of any volume comparison, We must have that data because otherwise ultrasound is worthless. And when that data comes out, if it ever does, oh yeah, Brad shouldn't do it because we know what results he'll get. Someone call Roberts, Cody Hahn's lab. They're doing all kinds of cool stuff. Please do this study, find out. When that data finds out, if it says I'm wrong, I'll be the first to admit it. And I'll go, hey, Brad's paper was right. The growth wasn't just fluid. It wasn't. I'll be happy to admit that I'm wrong. The data comes out and says that it was fluid. You think Brad will acknowledge that he was wrong? One more thing. As a final explanation the researchers allow, it is possible that the highlighted papers on volume, Brad's, were simply more effective for growth, and perhaps other studies are underdosing participants. This may be attributed to the additional volume, the experience and effectiveness of the training staff, or a combination of both these factors. Only respond, I get why they wrote that, I get why they had to, but come on, guys. Come on. Either Brad is the greatest trainer and coach in the history of time, or his studies are bullshit. And if you want to say that every other lab generating completely different results is simply fucking it up, and his two studies are the ones that are right, you're further beyond help than any of you ever could be. Finally, the conclusion, it's basically that while resistance training volume may very well be one of the more important factors influencing the hypertrophic response, we would suggest that the current evidence is much more ambiguous than clear. Indeed, recent work has demonstrated that groups that train with higher volumes experience a greater magnitude of growth compared to groups training with lower volumes. However, these studies appear to observe magnitudes of growth that may be outside of what is expected over the time frame examined. Even if volume does contribute to additional muscle group with additional sets, it is unlikely, in our opinion, that an increase in the magnitude of 0.7 centimeters at the group level is possible over 8 weeks' time as depicted in Schoenfeld. For these reasons, replication of these findings may be necessary before strong conclusions are drawn. If these studies are interpreted with caution, there appears to be much less compelling evidence that there is a dose response between resistance training volume and muscle growth. In fact, there are several investigations demonstrating similar growth between lower and higher volume training protocols in resistance-trained individuals. While there appears to be some threshold of volume that is necessary for muscle growth, the current recommendations may exaggerate its importance. It is our hope that this paper stimulates positive inquiry around and in the area of RT volume and muscle growth. I'm not screenshotting that because I'm tired of doing it. Go pull the paper. I read it verbatim from their conclusion. They're just being good little scientists saying, well, it might be, but we think these results are a little bit hard to believe, which is just a scientific way of saying, yeah, bullshit, buddy. If someone can replicate it outside of Brad's lab and show this, and we can get the data on swelling, I'll be happy to admit that I'm wrong. And before you bring up that recent 52-set study, I'd really suggest people go read the discussion and see what the researchers themselves said, which is not how people in this industry presented it, and I'll probably do a video on that shortly. So spare me but it has been replicated. Go read the discussion of that paper. No, it hasn't. And then here's screenshots of all the studies they accumulated showing growth. You can see they're all kind of in the same range, like 0.11 up to maybe 0.4 centimeters, depending. Brad's papers are the outliers. Either his lab is doing the best work, or the results are bullshit, and it's probably the latter. Now, I'm sure when my video or this paper is brought to Brad's attention, he will address it with the type of direct, cogent, coherent scientific rebuttal he is known for. You know, like when he said, I don't have to blind, you can trust me. Science. But let's face it, if you can look at all this, if you can look at this paper and not see who's right and who's wrong in this one, you are truly, truly beyond help, which is why I really don't bother with these videos anymore. But maybe I'll do another one, assuming I can be asked. Happy New Year's, dumb shits!